What's up, everybody? Marcus here. Thanks for tuning in this week, and I'm very excited because we haven't done something like this in quite some time. We have a very special episode for you. This episode and episodes like it are going to cover certain aspects of the history of trucking in the United States. I really enjoy learning about the trucking industry and how it runs now, but I also really enjoy hearing about the history, reading about the history, studying it, and knowing how we got to where we are today. By all means, trucking is a safer, more efficient industry than it's ever been before, and believe it or not, it makes more money and brings in more products to more places than any other industry that you can grasp. So without further ado, I present to you a very special episode of Trucking Up History presented by H&M Trucking. This is the Cabover Extinction.
From Omaha, Nebraska, to whatever lane you're driving, this is the H&M Trucking Podcast with your host, Marcus Bridges.
Deep in the wilderness of heartland America, you will find a species that is near extinction. This species once roamed freely across the United States, but ever since the 1970s, humans have single-handedly destroyed their population. In our world, you've got to remember, extinction is the rule, survival is the exception. Just as the dinosaurs once ruled the land, so did Cabovers. Both big creatures that could cover great distances. We know what happened to the former, but what happened to the latter? There sure as hell wasn't a meteor shower in the 1970s that I wasn't aware of. Luckily for our research purposes, a few of these great beasts, unlike dinosaurs, are still around for us to study. From Peterbilt to Kenworth to Freightliner, each had its own line of Cabovers cut off. Someday, maybe in less than 100 years, there won't be a single one left in the United States to look at. Let's discover the mass extinction of Cabovers that is still fizzling out as we speak. We've got to go all the way back to 1907 to see the beginnings of the Cabover. What was even happening in 1907? You could go to a movie for a nickel, UPS was founded, Mother's Day was created, the Cubs won the World Series, Teddy Roosevelt was president, and paper towels were also invented that year. For all you Cubs fans out there, don't worry. They won it again in 1908, but then they spent 107 years on the bench without winning it again. Cubs fans actually saw the rise and fall of Cabovers without winning a World Series in between, and with plenty of room to spare. Cabovers were also invented in the state to the north of Chicago. Every lactose intolerant's least favorite state, Wisconsin. The Sternberg Company of Wisconsin is to thank for making the first Cabover in 1907. However, by 1914, Sternberg basically got rid of their Cabovers. The end. But for once, let's thank Depression, because Sternberg reintroduced the Cabover in the middle of the Great Depression in 1933. This time with the cab tilted so people could access the engine. A bit of an oversight by Sternberg the first time around. Roughly around the same time, Viktor Schreckengost, who we can refer to as Shrek, thank God, designed a much more modern version of the Cabover. With the help of engineer Ray Spiller, these two men came up with the functional design of what many of our great-grandparents and grandparents drove on the road. Fun fact about our boy Shrek, he lived to be 101 years old and lived to meet George W. Bush. Shrek was not just the designer of the modern Cabover, as his foundation's homepage states, every adult in America has ridden in, ridden on, drunk out of, stored their things in, eaten off of, been costumed in, mowed their lawn, played on, lit the night with, viewed in a museum, cooled their room with, read about, printed with, sat on, placed a call with, enjoyed in a theater, hid their hooch in, collected, been awarded with, seen at a zoo, put their flowers in, hung on their wall, served punch from, delivered milk in, read something printed on, seen at the World's Fair, detected enemy combats with, written about, had an arm or a leg replaced with, graduated from, protected by, or seen at the White House, something created by Viktor Schreckengost. Put some credit on his name. Now we have even more reason to be thankful for Shrek. But getting back to the Cabover, Shrek designed the Cabovers for White Motor Company and later for International Harvester. While those aren't household names, Chevrolet, Ford, and Dodge brothers quickly adopted his designs for their Cabover body. Why not put the engine in the front like today's trucks do? The answer lies in a 10-letter word that rhymes with butternut. Any guesses? That's right, the government had laws in place at the time that limited the length of trucks to 42 feet on highways. That's roughly 6 twin beds glued together, nowhere near as long as today's trucks. Obviously, laws changed over time, yet it took decades until the 75-foot trucks like we see today were allowed on our highways. From Schreck's first design to the middle of the 1950s, Cabovers slowly began to take over the roads with all the major manufacturers hopping on the bandwagon. When Big Dick Eisenhower introduced the interstate system, Cabovers quickly grew in demand due to the ability to live out of them for long periods of time. From the late 1950s to the mid-1970s, the golden age of Cabovers was in full swing. So a change in infrastructure and a change in legislature, which allowed trucks to be 65 feet in 1956, ignited this beautiful era of trucks flatter than Fergie singing the national anthem. Peterbilt began producing the Model 352 in 1958. That was the first tilt cabover. If you've ever seen a cab look like it dropped its penny and is looking at the ground, that's a tilt cabover most likely. It allowed for easier access to things underneath the truck, like the engine. Other models that were produced around the same time included Ford's C-Series, Freightliner's tilting cab in 1958 that matched Peterbilt's, and Kenworth's famous K100 in 1964. Finally, drivers could go cross-country sleeping sorta comfortably in their cabs. Emphasis on sorta. Many rode firmly, and getting in and out of them after a long day was a bit of a challenge, especially for the older drivers. This is because the driver would technically have to back out of their seat and cling onto the rails to get out safely, not to mention having to watch their footing. Swift can't even back into a dock, so how would you expect one of their drivers to get out of a cabover? Because of this problem, some drivers performed what they would call the Tarzan exit. This is where the driver would grab the outer rail and swing out and down the truck. Luckily, they could still wear a shirt while doing this, unlike Tarzan. And unlike me eating hot dogs on the 4th of July. Problems definitely did exist with the cabover, yet for roughly 2 decades, they changed travel across the United States. All of a sudden, it was possible to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific in just a few days using the same driver and same truck without making someone sleep exactly where they drive. By the mid-1960s, if you wanted to take a road trip on the new interstate system, you'd be hard-pressed to find a stretch of road without one of these beasts. They represented a time when truckers ran harder than ever, bonded together, and were actually respected by those they shared the road with. So what happened to these cabovers that were such an iconic vehicle? It's not like you snapped your fingers and all the cabovers were gone overnight, but the decline of them was pretty rapid. It all started in 1975 when lawmakers proposed that starting the year after, trucks could have an extra 10 feet in length. Whoever says size doesn't matter obviously hasn't driven a truck before. Size matters and still does greatly. Although there was some pushback by a few states, this allowed for weight to be dispersed on the truck better, ultimately helping with conserving gas in a time when oil prices were stupid high. By 1982, the Federal Aid Highway Act shut up the bickering few states that held out and set national standards, not just for length, but also for weight. By then, it was just a matter of time for cabovers to go extinct in America, as cabovers were already on their way out the door after 1975. By the late 1990s, cabovers were pretty much discontinued from all major trucking manufacturers in the United States and became a rarer and rarer sight to see on the road. The introduction of long-nosed trucks really made the problems of cabovers even more apparent. Regardless of the Federal Aid Highway Act, truckers were going to eventually go away from cabovers since long-haul trucking with them had its problems. One of the largest issues with the cabover is that it had a limited size sleeping nook that sometimes was nearly on top of where the driver sat on their butt for 10 hours plus during the day. It was like a studio apartment for a mouse. Driver comfort became a big deal because there were greater lengths to be covered in less time. Say you're a 250-pound trucker, 6'2", and you want a comfortable night's rest, you'd have a much easier time getting that in a modern truck today than a cabover. This is also because many cabovers had the sleeping compartment of the cab directly over the diesel engine. While this probably made for a great vibrator and a great night in that regard, a sound night of sleep was difficult to come by. But at least it's not like sleep is important to have when you're driving for 10 plus hours each day. Oh, actually it is. The placement of the engine wasn't just an issue for sleep. It was also an issue for techs when working on the trucks. Most modern trucks today have a separate compartment for their engine in the front of their trucks, which gives easy access to important systems. However, In a Cabover, everything was mushed together, making it a puzzle for techs to diagnose issues in the truck. What's even worse is that by the late 1950s, you'd have to tilt your truck forward to access everything underneath. Imagine having to have a colonoscopy every time you get a little backed up. Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. Just like the prep day of hell before a colonoscopy, you'd have to prep everything in your truck for the cabin to be tilted 45 degrees. Everything from hats to pillows would be out of place, making for a lovely mess to clean up afterwards if you didn't prepare. You just have to make sure you wipe, or in this case, strap everything down. At least in Cabovers, you didn't have nearly as much stuff as most modern truckers have in the back of their cabs today. Yet, this could be considered another problem. Microwaves, mini fridges, and other items had no room in Cabovers. Unlike today's trucks, Cabovers weren't really able to be a second home because they didn't have space for all the things that a home consists of. At least truck stop diners were more affordable for drivers to eat at back then. To add on to our list of problems, Cabovers were considered to be less safe. This is mainly in instances of head-on collisions because a driver would technically only have a couple of inches in front of them to protect themselves instead of a long hood with a cushion in between the driver and the obstacle. The more space, the better. Remember, as our forefathers said, size matters. Size also mattered because engineers could design trucks with more powerful engines that could drive larger loads. Size matters in loads too. There's a reason oversized loads really took off once everyone decided long-nosed trucks were the shit. They had more power than Cabovers, and finally, they could move things like houses with more ease. Lastly, Cabovers couldn't compete with the open road speeds that the interstate system presented. Long-nosed trucks were seen as much more efficient than Cabovers back in the 1960s because they could maintain high speeds at a better fuel rate. While Cabovers tried, their wheelbase hindered them from being a top dog. At least they were, and still are, easier to maneuver. Now, a Swift driver might have a hard time backing their butts out of the cab. However, a Cabover might help them back into docks easier. Not just docks, though. Tight city streets and corners are easier to navigate in the Cabover. This is because Cabovers have a tighter turn radius than a traditional truck. So if you're a driver that only drives in the city, then a Cabover might actually be the better choice. The other main advantage of a Cabover is that a driver can see more when behind the wheel. This is because truck drivers sit further forward in them, which allows the enhanced visibility in the front and on the sides. Plus, the driver tends to sit up a little higher, giving them more of a bird's eye view. Again, if you're a driver who only does city driving, then a Cabover might be the better choice because navigating city traffic could be easier. Many times in America, you will see modern Cabovers like the Isuzu NPR on the city streets of New York or Chicago because of these reasons. Obviously, nobody is living out of them. However, they are driving a little easier in them in literal hell, also known as rush hour traffic in Atlanta. Yet, these aren't the long-haul Cabovers that the generations before us took to the roads with. Could there be a Cabover comeback in America? Unfortunately, there won't be any comeback like the 28-3 debacle that just happened to the Atlanta Falcons a few years back. The good news is, there's still a market for long-haul Cabovers, just not in the USA. Instead, let's look to a country that has lost to the USA a lot, but still utilizes Cabovers, such as Great Britain. Great Britain might be responsible for some cool accents, but they're still dealing with truck length regulations. Obviously, size doesn't matter to the Brits as much. At least it makes sense for those in Europe, such as Great Britain, France, Poland, and Germany, to use Cabovers. Their roads are tighter and their distances to cover are much less. For example, you can get from London to Edinburgh in Scotland in only 7 hours or so, or Paris to northern Italy in just over 9 hours. This day and age, most Cabovers are not manufactured in the States. While the extinction in America has been quick, at least these great beasts can go off and thrive in a new land. It's almost like Jurassic Park, but with a lot less death. There are still 1 or 2 manufacturers of Cabovers in the United States. However, what they make is shipped to Europe. So take a trip across the pond if you want to see these great beasts, or test your luck and see if you can find a vintage one on the road here in the United States.
Thank you for listening to the H&M Trucking Podcast. Please leave a review, subscribe, and connect with Marcus over at the H&M Trucking social media channels. And if you're considering a job at H&M, find us at hmtrucking.com. Until next time, stay safe and ahead of the curve drivers.